place is nowhere. And it's forever.
Ghosts of my life.
You're dead.
I believe that to be true. It'd be very nice to meet you one day, Mr. Jimmy Savile, just,
Well, if you've got a sister, you could meet me by bringing her along.
I mean, I haven't got any sisters, but...
I don't usually meet fellas, but if you've got a sister, that's okay.
I've got a personal assistant called Marsha, and part of her job description is that anyone I demand she greets, meets, massages, she has to do it. She's very attractive, Jimmy.
Well, that's a good start.
What kind of
start? You could send her along to do some research.
Would you like her to wear anything in particular, Sir Jimmy?
I'd actually prefer her to wear nothing.
Right. So you want Marsha, my assistant, to meet you naked? Okay. Well, that's not going to be a problem.
Nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that, Jimmy. It's just.
Okay. And speaking of things that don't age well, doubtlessly this episode and our decision to do it. Okay, this is special
bonus episode.
Bonus emergency episode of Lost Futures, a Mark Fisher podcast. Me and Steven shamelessly exploit a tragedy.
A tragedy known as Russell Brand, and we're here to talk about Russell Brand, but in the context of him being in Mark Fisher's
most infamous essay, Exiting the Vampire
Castle from 2013.
Okay, and in all seriousness, yeah, I thought personally a lot about doing this episode and whether I wanted to do it. We'll get into it, but I don't particularly like this essay.
So if you like it, turn off this right now.
But it is obviously an incredibly infamous essay of Mark Fisher. It's probably one of the first things many people read in experiencing Mark Fisher. It colored a lot of Mark Fisher's career afterwards.
It's like this in capitalist realism.
And additionally, it heavily features mentions of Russell Brand in it.
Accused sex offender, rapist,
possible pedophile, and, a lot of things. But,
we're gonna...
and after these allegations came out on some exceedingly specific circles of Twitter I travel in, people have been bringing up Exiting the Vampire Castle just because he's heavily featured in it, and among other things, it's a feature that does not age well. It did not age well before the allegations came out, I'd say. And it ages
a
even...
feature?
The
feature in the essay.
The feature in the essay. The use of Russell Brand as an example, and we'll discuss how he's used, because that is one thing that I kind of focus on in my reading of the essay. It hasn't aged well for the past few years, I'd say, as Russell Brand's sort of become increasingly more reactively, contrarianly finding himself in more and more anti-left circles.
Well, for one thing, he's known as sort of the face of the anti-vax movement.
Yeah,
online anti-vaxxers, kind of woo-woo space, kind of...
Right, a lot of that, new age to sort of reactionary through, distrust of institutions, and it sort of seems leftist at first, but, when tested, it sort of moves away from the material analysis. So that's been a thing for a few years, and then he just came out that he evidently did a lot of sexual assault and rape.
Yeah,
and
so we're recording this in 2023
I think we're gonna try and get this essay, this episode out
in September, but for future listeners, we're recording this about a week out after there's a Channel 4 documentary that comes out where 5 accusers come out and give their stories, harrowing and awful stories of him inviting them over, forcing himself upon them unconsensually. A lot of them, it seems like he had long relationships with, but within those relationships, a lot of non-consensual shit happened. And, he also dated a 16-year-old, which is, while he was 30, which was legal technically in Britain, but...
No one uses the sexual laws of England as a moral marker for ethics.
Yeah, so I think it'd be instructive or interesting to go first to an American audience, which a lot of our audience is, and explain who was Russell Brand before this, where did he come from, what is he known for, and why did Mark Fisher choose to use him in
He's the Forgetting
in the
Sarah
article.
Marshall guy.
Yeah, well, before he was in Forgetting Sarah Marshall, he got his start, like Jimmy Savile, being not necessarily a disc jockey, but he was an MTV host, like a British MTV host. And then later he was on a Big Brother spinoff, so a reality TV host.
No.
Which he was in for a couple of years, but this was all to further his comedy career, and he went on a number of tours, this solo ventures where he would go around and give these presentations. It's kind of a thing in England, but it's a thing here.
Yeah.
And then he landed some bigger...
Like your Hassan Minaj, speaking of people who there's funny news about recently.
Which, by the way, Hassan Minaj, happy this is happening.
Yeah, no, this really
I think Chapo said that Hassan Minaj cannot be happier Russell Brand is taken down.
Yeah.
Like 3 days after Hassan Minaj was called out for falsifying all his stories from his comedy special.
Just lying about his multimedia My Life as an Immigrant comedy presentation. But yeah, no, that kind of one-man show, high produced comedy.
A lot of his earlier stuff focused on it was very confessional. At first, he did a lot of I was an addict and I recovered, and here I am making jokes about it. I also have lots of sex, which he goes into at great depth. He does a lot of audience participation, which is a big thing in England. But then, around the time Vampire Castle comes out,
So he's basically a John Mulaney meets Stavros Halkias.
Yes. Ish. more like who was it that you were just talking? Louis C.K.
Yeah. No, I mean he's like those comedians from the 2000s.
And one of the rape culture was in a large part, if you go back in the 2000s in comedy, super glorified in comedy.
Yeah, no, they were very sexist for a very long time and still are.
And around the time Vampire Castle came out, he was touring on this one called Messianic Complex, which which depicted him as Che Guevara and had all these symbols, like a hippie symbol, a Star of David, a peace symbol, and I guess that would be the hippie symbol, but also a swastika. He was not allowed to perform in Germany at the time because he had a swastika in his marketing, and he had pictures of Malcolm X on stage. He had all these kind of aesthetics of kind of a populist leader. I think he brought out pictures of Jesus and he compared himself.
Right, he was doing kind of a tongue-in-cheek Pink Floyd's The Wall thing almost, it sounds like.
Yeah, and this is the thing that Mark Fisher saw in 2013.
Yeah, this was in fact the comedy special that gets mentioned in Exiting the Vampire Castle.
Right, and as he went along with his career, he wrote a book called Revolution, which was I think his most explicit call to arms against whatever. He had this cult of personality that he built up over years,
I mean, he was absolutely one of the crowd of even pre-Bernie people who were, in America, they're even more left than the Young Turks. Like, kind of group. And then when Bernie happened, I mean, I remember there was a time where I even said, I can't wait till we have enough public socialist figures that I can start hating some of these people.
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah, one of the guys. He was, in fact, one of the guys.
A funny factoid about his MTV gig is he got fired from
God,
MTV.
yes, this actually is kind of funny.
It's kind of funny. He comes into work.
Terrible person, but this is.
He comes into work on September 12th, 2001 with his drug dealer and dressed as Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
And they fire him on the spot, or like...
That's like the shit they used to make up that Tom Green did.
Yeah, he kind of does occupy that, like...
Yeah, where Tom Green, like, apparently, like, dressed as Hitler, went to a synagogue, which he never fucking did, and was, like, shocked and offended when those rumors started.
He eventually basically stopped doing movies and stopped doing a lot of his appearances on TV and focused exclusively on his podcast, of which he has 2 or 3. I think he has one on meditation and spirituality and like self-help kind of guru stuff, but also one on like addressing the news and controversial topics. And this was popular leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic. But once the COVID-19 pandemic kind of became the focus of everybody's life, he was one of the dissenting voices, which was considered, by many like a left-wing figure in the media, saying, no, this is crazy. Why are we getting these vaccines? Why should we listen to Fauci, et cetera, et cetera? I think he was a denialist at first, and then he was a Wuhan kind of like conspiracy theory that it came from the Wuhan Institute. That's a big thing for him. And he convinced a lot of other people and then became like, I compare him to Joe Rogan.
I mean,
over
certainly
there.
in the sense that, then you can remember the liberals during COVID who are like, Joe Rogan is personally responsible for 5.5 million deaths.
Yeah.
Kind of shit where it's like, yeah, okay. Like, I mean, yeah, you can, and also not to downplay it, but like, yeah, no, I mean, that sort of your body as a temple kind of...
Yeah, woo-woo.
Yeah, woo-woo stuff that has places in both the left and the right, and has a lot of crossover, your, MAGA New Age, QAnon New Age, crossovers, that kind of stuff. And, yeah, I mean, I think it's a thing that happens to a lot of people, but where they're ostensibly leftist or apolitical, or, like, to Brand's credit, he absolutely called himself a socialist before it was cool. So he was never exactly presenting himself as apolitical, but it was seemingly a reactive, I call it reactive anti-authoritarianism, or I think contrarianism is a more common, if inexact, thing to call it, where you just are against some prevailing notion, you find yourself in a subgroup, all of a sudden you realize, oh, that's a prevailing notion.
Yeah. Well, I compare his arc very much to Joe Rogan because they're both people that started as presenters, as reality TV show presenters, for one thing, which reality TV was sort of like this thing that Joe Rogan got popular, like game shows, Fear Factor, but also Donald Trump kind of gained notoriety and fame under. And a lot of what people think of these figures is not like, what they believe in or like even who they are as like individuals, but like the characters on the reality shows that they play.
Sure.
There is this certain sense of like you see this person every day on the TV, you feel like you know them. A lot of people say that about Donald Trump. I think there's a lot of identification with Joe Rogan, at least getting his start. Like, oh, it's the Fear Factor, he has a podcast. Here it's like, oh, it's the Big Brother guy, he has a podcast. Let me listen to his podcast. And then
oh my God, it's the janitor from News Radio. I feel like I know him. But yeah, Andy Dick was also on that show, and he also did rapes. So that's not a connection to Russell Brand at all. It's a connection to Joe Rogan. But anyway.
But the other thing is that they call the thing in plain sight, and I feel like every British rape allegation is, you know, blank name in plain sight.
Well, we have one major broadcaster, and everyone who worked there knew about this.
And everyone in the industry was in on protecting
And also,
him.
you're watching this news program on that broadcaster.
Oh yeah,
we really got the script ready to go.
It's very Jimmy Savile, right?
Right,
Like there's
yeah,
a Jimmy Savile, except they didn't wait until Russell Brand fucking died.
Yeah.
They went after him. They had it ready. They'd been doing this for years.
Well, they're like, we need to fucking... We're not injecting enough microchips in British children because Russell Brand is a brave truth teller.
Well, that's literally what his defenders are saying.
That is literally what his defenders are saying. That's not a thing, I think. I think he did rapes. But anyway, yeah.
He knew too much.
Yeah.
He knew too much about the people and power.
Yeah, no, Bill Gates really was like, okay, BBC, we need to release the documentary now. Yeah, so anyway, yeah. So that's who Russell Brand is. Let's do this goddamn it.
All right, let's do it. We're going to take a little break.
Cause all you people are vampires, and all your stories are stale. And though you pretend to stand by us, I know you're certain we'll fail. Well, I've seen your eyes as they fix on me, full of confusion.
All right, so with that all said about Russell Brand exiting the vampire castle. Actually, the first time I heard about Russell Brand was this, and when I read it, I didn't know who he was, and I didn't know who Owen Jones was before reading this either.
Owen Jones is briefly mentioned in this, and I don't know why. I don't have a problem with Owen Jones other than he's kind of a shitlib, but, you know, whatever. Like, he's fine. Yeah, so Mark Fisher's sad about Twitter.
This summer, I seriously considered withdrawing from any involvement in politics. Exhausted through overwork, incapable of productive activity, I found myself drifting through social networks, feeling my depression and exhaustion increasingly. Left-wing Twitter can often be a miserable, dispiriting zone. And I think kind of sets the tone. He is talking about the internet. He doesn't like the way people are kind of... earlier this year, there were some high-profile Twitter storms in which particular left-identifying figures were, quote, called out and condemned. What these figures had said was sometimes objectionable. But nevertheless, the way in which they were personally vilified and hounded left a horrible residue. The stench of bad conscience and witch-hunting moralism. The reason I didn't speak out on any of these incidents, I'm ashamed to say, was fear. The bullies were in another part of the playground. I didn't want to attract their attention to me.
So, he names his first example as Owen Jones. He doesn't say what anyone was angry at Owen Jones for. I, again, don't know what anyone was angry at Owen Jones for. Owen Jones, for those of you who don't know, is a gay social democratic reporter from England, who makes gay rights, trans rights a somewhat central issue, as well as income inequality for him. His work in trans rights is against a lot of the general milieu of British transphobia, and some of his work I think is quite commendable. I've never had an issue with the guy. He's kind of a liberal when you get down to it.
He's an electoralist.
Yeah, he's
certainly.
an electoralist. He's like a little rah-rah on Ukraine. But yeah, he's whatever. He's cool.
I saw a really good interview.
He does great interviews.
Really good interview with Judith Butler.
Yeah. His Judith Butler interview.
Judith Butler
awesome.
interview is amazing. He gives her really good context to speak about transphobic feminists, as she calls them, or they call them.
He's always struck me as like an okay guy.
And then Mark Fisher relays that he went to a people's assembly being kind of a socialist gathering, or I've always associated them with anarchists, but
well, I mean, you have people's assemblies all the time. Like anyone could do a people's assembly. It's just you and your friends hanging out.
Yeah, it's
in Ipswich.
In Ipswich, near where I live. Yeah, he's like, oh, there's some sneers and snarks, but when they were there, there was some good speakers speaking about
and to the
left-wing issues.
Yeah, okay. So essentially, gee, ain't it weird that when we come together at rallies and shit as leftists, we tend to get along, but then people are mean and catty online. Which, true. We can decide how novel that idea is, but yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I always go back to, like, back in the days of, like, the weird fucking hyper-factionalism when, like, all the, like, old ML parties of the 70s wanted to make themselves known in 2016 on Facebook. You have, like, WWP and PSL, like, being weird and shit, but, like, I've also been to rallies with them in DSA, and it's like, yeah, whatever, we actually get along.
Yeah, well, it's a very, like, activist, left-wing activist kind of thing where you have your differences, you have ideological, and you're very loud about it in private or on social media.
Yeah, I mean, this could also be true of, like, a shared listserv for a poetry reading in New York. Like, yeah, I mean, it's generally true. Ain't it a shame? Anyway, let's talk about Russell Brand.
And then we have the subject of this entire thing, which is Russell Brand, who...
We already went over who Russell Brand is. Don't need to do that again. Apparently, he had this interview with Michael McIntyre that didn't really... I think I might have seen it even.
Yeah, it was... I think it was a big
to
do.
Like, I think I remember seeing it at the time and going like, oh, yeah, that's cool. But, yeah, so apparently the controversy that Mark Fisher is launching this entire goddamn essay about is Russell Brand is being called a sexist online. And it's in the context... I don't think it has to do directly with anything he's said in that interview. I think it's like more a general commentary on his...
They're trying to dismiss his left-wing positions that he states on...
Because he calls women beds.
Yeah, it's... Where is that quote?
I don't know. He has this like fucking quote that like almost reminds me of like the people who like obnoxiously go to trans women about, oh, I call everyone dude, actually.
Yeah.
It kind of is what the quote reminds me of. Yeah, I'm from California. Like, my mom is a dude. Here it is. It's 7:39. It's the block quote.
Yeah, this is Russell Brand. I don't think I'm sexist, but I remember my grandmother, the loveliest person I've ever known, but she was a racist. But I don't think she knew. I don't know if I have some cultural hangover. I know that I have a great love of proletariat linguistics like darling and bird. So if women think I'm sexist, they're in a better position to judge than I am. So I'll work on that.
Okay, so anyway, it's essentially saying the controversy is Russell Brand being called a sexist, but look at this great fucking comedy special he put out that is hyperclass conscious, and he made some very particular socialist calls in his interview and kind of bested this snooty reporter, but even that is being interpreted in just some of the most uncharitable ways possible. And what's the deal with that? That's
he says
basically what we're doing.
For the moralizers, the dominant story was to be about Brand's personal conduct, specifically his sexism. In the febrile, McCarthyite atmosphere fermented by the moralizing left, remarks that could be construed as sexist mean that Brand is a sexist, which also meant that he is a misogynist. Cut and dried, finished and condemned.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, it's like, unfortunate that seems like they were right.
Yeah, no,
Shit.
it does seem like the
fucking hindsight's 2020, and apparently foresight at the time.
It seems like the moralizers here were 100% correct.
I mean, like, oh, okay. But yeah, okay, so we're identifying a particular thing of this.
He calls it a number of things. Posh left.
Right, but of this thing of, you know, the most uncharitable reading of the worst thing we can find you say defines you as a person.
Yeah. And then that is used to dismiss your working class values or background, and particularly he focuses on working class background, the way you talk, the way you look, the way you act, against the bourgeoisified media is always used to kind of police people's actions that the bourgeois deems unnecessary, which are then leveraged to dismiss you and a leftist working class position, right? Like,
yeah, which, you know, I don't think it was particularly effective. I don't know. So, I mean, I've gone over it a few times, and like I said, I read this essay a bunch before doing this episode, just because it's never been my favorite essay. I want to be able to talk about it without just being, you know, dismissive or critical or whatever. But also I want to, you know, say how I'm trying to work through this essay. Yeah, and I think it's interesting, though, that I feel like a lot of people, and I feel like even we're doing that, where we're sort of reading in this argument that he's saying, like, oh, this is a tactic by the bourgeois to shut down socialist ideas. But I think it almost gets phrased as it's like more like just an umbrage at Russell Brand being this ill-mannered person because he encapsulates these proletarian features in almost, I think, an ironically essentialist way when it's the thing that he's arguing against. And that's a thing that's sort of in my readings in trying to, like, say what I have a problem and you know, substantiate it, because a lot of people, they read this essay and they say either, you know, it's racist or sexist or whatever. It's a class reductionist essay.
Yeah, class reductionism
that says we should sideline race and sex and this, that, and the other thing, and acts like class is more important. On the one hand. On the other hand, there's people who read this essay and do think that the left should be more racist, and this essay somehow supports that. So I don't want to just say that. But like in developing where I'm starting to have an issue is he often describes Brand, in his introduction. Then there was Russell Brand. I've long been an admirer of Brand, one of the few big-name comedians on the current scene to come from a working-class background. And he kind of always, like, fronts that even before he talks about what Russell Brand's actually saying. Mm-hmm. And I get, like, actually a somewhat limited sense of what Russell Brand's actually saying from this.
It's always kind of sweepingly, he's anti-immigrant,
he's pro-immigrant.
Anti-racist, pro-immigrant, anti-imperialist is what I was thinking. Yes. It's the anti-imperialism, and, that might be kind of where the British kind of class system, especially if you're being anti-imperialist, it is seen as like, ha ha ha, well, we have the royals who you should be dignified about imperialism because they're our mom and our dad or whatever.
But anyway, so they're making it about his personal conduct. They're making it about...
There's also a shocking but revealing aside where the individual casually refers to Brand's patchy education and the often wince-inducing vocab slip characteristic of the autodidact, which this individual generously says, I have no problem with that at all. How very good of them.
Right, and again, I think this is interesting because it's not even like he's making a materialist argument. He's honestly Fisher is seemingly making an argument that I find to be very similar to, your Tumblr left from 2013 argument about, yes, this person is doing a microaggression, about how, if you just switched, like, working class language for, like, African American vernacular English, this would sound like a very familiar...
Which is why I think this got a lot of play.
Right, but I think that also kind of undercuts... Like, it...
Because it does seem more high-minded, especially in the second half of the essay than this, but it really starts off as kind of an internet rant.
After this, we're going to get into Fisher's structure, and we will get into Fisher's structure. But I just find it interesting, class versus quote-unquote identitarianism, or class versus, base versus superstructure, what have you. It's an ever-present question in Marxism. It's been dealt with in Marx's time. It's been dealt with in Lenin and the national question. It's an ever-present question on the left, and particularly with the way Marxism views the world. And to me, there's kind of a thing that arises from that I'm not saying Fisher entirely agrees with, but I think there's ways in which this essay backs up that isn't interested in a materialist reading of base and superstructure. Class is this material conflict over things, race, etc. are these languages and ideology used to support that, and how those dialectically interact and whatever. There's another one that's essentially, I would say, a liberal electoralist argument that is simply, for example, in America, most people aren't black, most people actually are women, but, whatever. Most people aren't gay, but most people are working class, and we should just talk about those issues because it doesn't alienate as many people. And the problem with that isn't, whether it's racist or sexist or whatever, it has issues there. But the problem is, first and foremost, it's not fucking Marxist, it's not leftist, it's a liberal electoral strategy that you just happen to be making in the abstract. And I feel like the way he talks about class in this is the problems faced by the working class are not necessarily material ones, but just that they're judged for being in the wrong space a lot of the time.
I mean, as much as
that's what I think.
I think that the context maybe that's missing for us as Americans, and this is me just kind of spitballing and not really knowing because I can't know. Not that I wouldn't be able to educate myself.
We don't have the lived experience.
We don't have
the British schoolboy.
We don't have
the British public schoolboy.
But I think that the class structure in England.
Well, number one, it's like even marked by an accent. So that alone.
It's marked by an accent. It's also marked by, first and foremost, proximity to royalty. It is hierarchical in a way that is visible to people, and also very, to go along with the accent, like very city by city. Some cities are considered coming from a working class background.
That's true. I mean, you're from Baltimore in America.
Right, but also in England, not everybody's like squished together so much closer than America.
No,
and the cities are very...
it's the size of New Jersey and equally factionalized.
I'm from Ipswich. I have a certain culture. I also have a certain father whose father whose father whose father was a miner. You know, this kind of like...
Right.
There is a...
yeah, I think that's definitely a part of it. My response would be, it doesn't change the critique. That's just the... Like, what is he talking about then? Is he talking about class as the, material Marxian relation, or is he talking about a set of identity signifiers that are understandable to English people?
Well, I think, yeah,
but I mean, if it's a set of identity... I mean, where's the quote about, like, Russell Brand being rich or whatever? But, if it is a set of identity signifiers, then, well, you're just arguing class is a better set of identity signifiers to strategize around. You're not arguing that class is something other than a set of identity signifiers, and I would think that it is a different thing.
But once class has reappeared, it was impossible not to see it everywhere in the response to the Brand affair. Brand was quickly judged and or questioned by at least 3 ex-private school people on the left. Others told us that Brand couldn't really be working class because he was a millionaire. It's alarming how many quote-unquote leftists seem to fundamentally agree with the drift behind Paxman's question. What gives this working class person the authority to speak? It's also alarming, actually distressing, that they seem to think that working class people should remain in poverty, obscurity, and impotence lest they lose their quote-unquote authenticity.
Yeah, so there's a part of that I don't disagree with, and I think, it's not about how much money you have, it's about your relation to the means of production, but also, he doesn't make that second argument there.
I also think a lot of this, and maybe he said it in the paragraph before, he's not really even talking about the people there so much as the discussion about class is absent from media.
Right. I mean, is he saying that because he just said that the thrust of Paxman's question was what gives this working class person the right, which I think is interesting because I would think the thrust of Paxman's question is what gives this millionaire a right. I think that it's deconstructible on both fronts, but, he seems to think that class is sort of present there. He seems to think that Russell Brand is being actively viewed as working class and prejudiced against because of it.
He's saying that, or at least he says that prior to this interview, that class had not been raised in media for years. He had been speaking at left-wing protests and left-wing things for years and years and years, and nobody asked him about class because, according to him, on the left, there was no interest to talk about class or class consciousness or raising class consciousness.
Also, I think that's since the New Left in the 60s and the fall of the Soviet Union and how activism...
Blair
and how activism took place in the 90s and 2000s. Yeah, absolutely. There was an active sidelining of class.
And I think that's what he's talking about.
Liberalized markers of identity were used as markers of progress in certain ways that fundamentally did not threaten the system. And if anything, probably served the system. It's better for your female employees to feel comfortable coming to work than not comfortable coming to work. It's also, objectively better that women feel comfortable going to work. But, it does help the company, too. And class was sidelined, and that is partially what this is reacting to. I think I spelled out where my issues with sort of how he tackles this discussion goes, because I think there's often, on the one hand, the critique you get from liberals, on the other hand, an actual argument I've heard from people purporting to be leftists, which is the liberals say, oh, you say you're against idpol, but class is just another identity. You just happen to like that identity category. And then I have heard ostensible leftists in the Pat Soch space and the this, that, and the other thing say, oh, well, we should appeal to the guy who might be racist, but he still wants a pay raise.
Yeah.
And
that
I think
class consciousness means to take on the reactionary position.
Or not even that those reactionary positions are separate and apart from class, which is kind of a set of unifying political arguments to be had by this broad-reaching identity that, essentially they'd say, oh, well, only 10 or so % of people are black, only so many %, but, 70% of people are working class, and you should therefore talk about oppression just on those ends. That way everyone will agree with it. And they are basically, to the liberals' point, just not saying there's anything special about class other than just it's an identity that I think I can make a broad electoral strategy around.
Well, and I think my comparison to Mark Fisher's experience with Brand was the first time I heard Bernie Sanders talk on the television about class.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, oh my God, this is the first time I've heard somebody talk about the millionaires and billionaires and how they should pay their fair share.
Mm-hmm.
And that was exciting. It was the first time I had ever heard it before. I know it wasn't the first time you'd ever heard it, but I think it was the first time in American mainstream media that it, at least for 30, 40 years.
What was it? Lassallean revisionism? Absolutely. But you know what? We were fine with it. It was the best we ever got.
To me, the Russell Brand and Paxman, it reminds me of if Bernie were talking to someone like Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, ostensibly a left-wing,
right,
center-left.
And I think that there's a thing to be said about, shutting down the ideas and shutting down the threats to bourgeois power. But the way Fisher words it almost sounds as if they're just like, oh, listen to this uppity working class person annoying me.
Which is what they did about Bernie a lot.
Well, I mean,
how can he speak as a socialist if he has 2 or 3 houses and has over $1 million?
They're not. No one is dismissing Bernie because they think he's working class. No one's making that argument one way or the other. They might dismiss him as a hypocrite. They might dismiss him on vaguely, arguably anti-Semitic grounds. But, they're not saying, oh, this working class simpleton doesn't know what he's talking about, which is sort of what the argument...
Well, they do that with healthcare, like how you don't know what you're talking about with healthcare. You don't know how much that'll make other people cost, it's a very...
Right,
like,
they're not saying you're wrong because you're working class, which is almost what I feel like is getting implied in this essay with Russell Brand, which is the thing I find weird.
Yeah. But that's the closest analogy.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, look, insofar as the phenomenon of these socialist ideas being dismissed and what have you, and the use of moralizing judgmental categories that turn out to be true 10 years later. But to do so, I understand. I just think that there is, to the extent this essay gets both critiqued from liberals and maybe misinterpreted by reactionaries, I don't think this essay did itself many favors.
It is not very clear. It kind of comes across as of a Gen X person ranting about millennials on the internet. And that's sort of the next part, but in very high academic terms.
I mean, mid-academic terms. Anyway, so Mark Fisher decides that there are two libidinal discursive configurations that he needs to talk about. This is, I think, the part where the essay sort of becomes a theory.
And better. And better than
better, yes, sure. So there's two libidinal discursive configurations are the vampire's castle and neo-anarchism. The vampire castle is a construct that Fisher came up with that he describes in terms of a trifecta of the priest's desire to excommunicate and condemn, the academic pedant's desire to be the first to spot a mistake, not to be an academic pedant, but that sounds very similar to the previous one, and the hipster's desire to be in the in crowd.
Yeah, I think he's mad about the people with their lattes and their avocado
toast. It's a construct. I mean, essentially what this is a construct to describe what he's perceiving as these unspoken rules of this Twitter space mob mentality.
Twitter space mob mentality that comes from, he identifies it as petite bourgeois in values, sort of like a middle class people who are for progress and for, left-wing values of like inclusivity and social progress. Like, we're going to make the world a better place. But at the heart of them, they don't have a class analysis to any of their things. And whenever class is brought up, they are the first ones to say, you can't talk about class. And then they give a bunch of different reasons why.
Mm-hmm. So,
and if you're online and you're listening to this,
I mean, basically, this is my thing with this, is it's like, he even has a paragraph in here where it's like, he's just like, it's like Nietzsche's Christianity and Genealogy of Morals, and it's like Nietzsche's Christianity and Genealogy of Morals, basically. I mean, like, I don't know how much more there is you can say. Apparently you can lay out the rules of the vampire castle, but like, I mean, it's essentially there's this like libidinal jouissance desire to be in this in-group that's constantly condemning the outside, and then it turns on itself and condemns itself because it's dealing with its own collective impotence. I think it's like a really quick and dirty.
And specifically, it seems like it comes from a middle-class place, and additionally, on top of that, because they don't have they don't have a class position or a class consciousness, they view the more marginalized the position of somebody suffering, the better, and the more dominant the position in society.
Yeah, essentially, it comes up with these constructs and rules, and whoever's the best at following those rules is the best person.
Oppression Olympics, I think, is a fair...
Is the words that he's not using, but it has these values and rules, and then we all judge each other based on how good we all are, at encapsulating those values and rules, and the best way you can prove your adherence to the values and rules is to condemn someone for failing to live up to them.
Right.
Kind of like Christianity and Nietzsche's worldview. He has this thing about, in all the Twitter storms about privilege earlier this year, it was noticeable that the discussion of class privilege is entirely absent. And I'll just say, because class privilege doesn't exist. Class isn't a superstructural identity for which there's rules built around it. It's literally the relationship of what you have and don't have. That's not an extra. It is what class is. And it's always kind of just an annoying thing where it's someone is going to look at that and say, oh, you just think class is a better identity.
Yeah. And then there's, it reverses that, right? He's saying it reverses, the more marginalized it is, the better, and the lack of class.
Right. Anyway, so
privilege discussion is a result of people only seeing everything but class.
Right. Yeah.
The big thing he talks about, the largest paragraph.
The laws of the vampire cast.
Yeah.
Okay, so first law is individualize and privatize everything. I don't know, I think this is fairly consistent with a lot of Mark Fisher writing. He's an atomization man. He's interested in how the collective is brought to the individual, and I think there's a point to be made. I think, frankly, you could stretch this out into an essay, and I'd probably like it better, but where you could, what before necessarily must be collective discussions about, race and sex and gender and all that, and how these societal wrongs were done in the past and how they affect things now, needs to be a collective discussion, but instead it just gets atomized into, you said something wrong, you are therefore a racist, and you're a bad person. And it's not a collective effort, it's just everyone simply needs to be a better person, and they're individually failing, and that's why we can't have this.
Sit down, know your place.
Mm-hmm.
And also, he says here he identifies it as a petite bourgeois to the core, which I think is correct. Because they are petite bourgeois to the core, the members of the vampire castle are intensely competitive, but this is repressed in the passive-aggressive manner typical of the bourgeoisie. What holds them together is not solidarity, but mutual fear. The fear that they will be the next one to be outed, exposed, condemned. And yeah, that is sort of the kind of small business owner mentality of we need to be hyper competitive, we need to be always on the hustle grind culture, and we need to stab the people in the backs that are closest to us, lest we are the ones that are stabbed in the back.
Right, sure. Okay,
Second law of the vampire castle is make thought and action appear very, very difficult, which is kind of there's no humor.
I don't fucking know what this is. I mean, I guess it's just kind of a reflexive impotence.
Well, I read into it more of he complains about the post-structuralist left, but I think it is kind of these people who are reading French academics are let me be nuanced and be deconstructionist.
Okay.
And that sort of thing of also being paired with, we need to look into things really hard and we can't laugh about them because less we're laughing about those that are suffering.
Yeah, anyway, the right's getting better at comedy. It's making the left nervous. Third law is propagate as much guilt as you can. I mean, again, I think this is consistent with the first law, consistent with the general sort of Nietzschean, Freudian libidinal economy of guilt that he's trying to lay out here. This is essentially using guilt as a control mechanism.
Well, he's also saying it's okay to be class privileged if you feel guilty about privilege and make others in a subordinate class position to you feel guilty too. This always reminds me of I know I'm the inheritor of wealth. I know that I am.
We are giving this podcast on Lenape lands.
Yeah, this. I'm just letting you know I'm a white man, and you can judge me accordingly, but I know that I'm in a dominant class, and I don't have anywhere to say anything to say about it. And how dare I, as a white man, talk over others? But here, I'm going to give you my opinion anyways.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of strategy,
Okay,
self-effacement.
essentialize, again, what we were talking about earlier, because you say a bad thing, you are a bad person, etc.
Well, and here I think he's also talking sort of about post-structuralist left, this idea of the fluidity of identities, and this supposed belief that, we're not all essentialized and we shouldn't judge the book by the cover and you shouldn't judge somebody based on where they come from or who they are. But at the same time, that's all they do. And when push comes to shove, they're going to sideline you because of who you are, no matter what. I experience this a lot among, as somebody who work with postmodern philosophy a lot, and the French school in particular. There seems to be this idea that, everything is a little bit fluid, everything is a little, truth is under investigation all the time. But when it comes down to it, we're going to have a pretty clear idea about who the enemy is no matter what, and it's always going to be in line with bourgeois state propaganda.
I'm glad I'll never be canceled. And the fifth law is think like a liberal because you are one. Yeah. Anyway, so the next part is neo-anarchism.
Oh yeah, okay, so that was the first one.
Yeah, so he has two libidinal discursive complexes.
Yeah, and they both seems to be like lefties that went to college.
Both seem to be people that annoy me.
Universities, people that went to college and claim themselves to be lefties.
Okay, neo-anarchists are just Mark Fisher's word for performative ultra-leftists on the internet who, essentially just say that the only morally ethical thing you can do is protest. But there's nothing that actually can ever be changed. And he doesn't like them either and thinks that they're also...
Well, would you say that they're similar to, you've complained about this, like the anarchists that are pro-NATO?
No, I don't think... I think he's talking about something different. I think he's those guys would actually be kind of the opposite in many ways. No, those are the people who say, actually voting for Biden is harm reduction. No, I think he's talking about, just people who won't join any left-wing organization because you're kind of dumb for thinking they could be successful. Say that, voting is stupid, that doing anything is stupid.
So nihilistic kind of
defeatist
your general
attitude. Your general defeatist is a common thing. It's a common thing today, but it was a common thing in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s, before. Yeah. It's particularly in America where there was no identifiable, self-identified left-wing or socialist project. Before recently, where you did have kind of a generalized doomer left of people who just are in fact smarter than everyone else enough to realize that we live in a hopeless shithole, but also are incredibly annoying about it.
And that's especially consistent on the American side during this time, 2013.
Yeah, absolutely.
2013, second Obama term.
Yeah, I didn't fucking vote for Obama. I'm not a fucking rube.
Yeah. Yeah, me neither, man. We were the neo-anarchies of the USA.
Yeah.
But it annoys him, I think, because it is...
Right, again, this all feels like kind of crab bucket mentality, reflective impotence, whatever you want to call it. Just like a general defeatist understanding of your own irrelevance, so you can only attack one another.
And he also links this with depression, similar to in capitalist realism, where because there's a reflexive impotence, there is this lack of faith in an institution that gave them the NHS, and they don't appreciate it, and they gave them, what has the empire ever done for us? Given us roads and aqueducts and brought peace.
Yep. Anyway,
How dare these kids think that politics can do nothing for them?
Okay, so then he has his praxis section. I don't know, be nicer to each other and touch grass.
Well, he talks about it, touch grass, but also, like, he says Jody Dean calls the internet this communicative capitalism, and that this kind of results in cyberspace or the internet being this way that at first appears as like a democratically accessible thing that people can get together and get along on and be able to link up and...
Right, it's cliche, but they are in fact commodifying your outrage.
Right.
Like they are in fact, there is a clear financial incentive to put you on a cycle of constant engagement via anger at your fellow man. And that does happen.
Yeah. So what can we do now? First of all, it is imperative to reject identitarianism and recognize that there are no identities, only desires, interests, and identifications. Part of the importance of the British Cultural Studies Project, as revealed so powerfully and so movingly in John Akamfra's installation, The Unfinished Conversation, currently in the Tate Britain, and his film, The Stuart Hall Project, was to have resisted identitarian essentialism. Instead of freezing people into chains of already existing equivalences, the point was to treat any articulation as provisional and plastic. New articulations can always be created. No one is essentially anything. Sadly, the right act on this insight more effectively than the left does. The bourgeois identitarian left knows how to propagate guilt and conduct a witch hunt, but it doesn't know how to make converts. But that, after all, is not the point. The aim is not to popularize a leftist position or to win people over to it, but to remain in a position of elite superiority. But now, with class superiority redoubled by moral superiority to, quote, how dare you talk, it's we who speak for those who suffer.
Yep.
But the rejection of identitarianism can only be achieved by the reassertion of class. A left that does not have class at its core can only be a liberal pressure group. Class consciousness is always double. It involves a simultaneous knowledge of the way in which class frames and shapes all experience and a knowledge of the particular position that we occupy in the class structure. It must be remembered that the aim of our struggle is not recognition by the bourgeoisie, nor even the destruction of the bourgeoisie itself. It is the class structure, a structure that wounds everyone, even itself, even those who materially profit from it, that must be destroyed. The interests of the working class are the interests of all. The interests of the bourgeoisie are the interests of capital, which are the interests of no one. Our struggle must be towards the construction of a new and surprising world, not the preservation of identities shaped and distorted by capital.
Yeah.
Which, as you point out, kind of contradict his earlier positions on class, but also taken out of context seem like a pretty good orthodox reading of class, right?
Yeah, sure. It's also like non-specific. I mean, what does making class at the center of your movement mean? I mean, like, yeah, sure, okay, how it relates to in your particular place and all, but like, yeah, it's also just generally saying we should talk or think about class more, or like I guess. I don't know. I mean, yeah.
I will say I like the end here. I think if you took out the first two parts and you kind of just left the ending, that would be a better essay than the whole thing put together.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's kind of rhetorical. It kind of reads like something that you could have as a speech, even about like a working class party that uses class at the center of its thing and doesn't. And the thing that's weird about it is it does kind of play into a color blindness.
Yeah, it does kind of play into a color blindness.
And that color blindness is I think a lot of your problem with it, because what does that color blindness imply? And the effects of people who see that color blindness and just use it as a way to give liberty to more reactionary positions.
You know, I'm okay with. I consider myself an orthodox Marxist. I'm okay with the notion that, and I've been saying it this whole fucking time, frankly, that class is different than race for certain reasons. I'm okay with that. I don't think it's different than race because it's like of some numerical superiority of the working class versus the oppressed races. I don't think it's different than race because it's, you know, more unifying or less divisive. I think it's, you know, occupies a different material structure than race does. So yeah, in that sense, yeah, I mean, the identity is shaped or distorted by capital. Sure, that's a way of describing it. You know, it's like, I mean, I can't blame him for an effect of colorblindness at the end of his essay. I mean, you're not going to then work out some complex, nuanced thing about the dialectical relationship between base and superstructure now. Mm-hmm. Like, that's not what you were doing in this fucking essay. You're not going to start in the last, like, 3 fucking paragraphs of it. So, yeah, in that sense, I'm not, like, blaming him. But, yeah, fine. Yeah, we should generally, I guess, yeah, remember that class is important, I suppose.
If this seems like a forbidding and daunting task, it is. But we can start to engage in many prefigurative activities right now. Actually, such activities would go beyond prefiguration. They could start a virtuous cycle, a self-fulfilling prophecy in which bourgeois modes of subjectivity are dismantled and a new universality starts to build itself. We need to learn or relearn how to build comradeship and solidarity instead of doing capital's work for it by condemning and abusing each other.
Like, I think that there's a good Mark Fisher thesis out there that, like, about that collectivism versus atomization thing, that, you know, we should be treating social problems as social problems, not as individualized pathologies of bad character. And, like, I think there's a great argument, and he touches upon that at a certain point in this essay. And I think there's something there. My old Bordiga quote I love to paraphrase is like, yeah, Stalin could have killed like 10 times the number of people they said he did. I just wish he was a Marxist. So yeah, this essay could be like more racist than it actually is. I just wish it was Marxist. I don't find this essay to be...
That's a poll quote that won't get you canceled.
Oh yeah, no, that is... I will never be canceled. I will better people than you have tried, motherfuckers.
There we go. We have
better fucking people than you.
We got the poll quote.
I am the expert at the Vampire Castle. I will cancel you first.
Marlowe is the Vampire Castle. He is speaking from it right now. He's in it.
Yeah, like, I don't view this essay as racist or sexist or class reduction. I mean, a little bit. But, like, also I don't view it as, like, making enough of a complex argument for it to even be class reductionist. In its prescriptions, it kind of has some sounds nice, but isn't specific enough for me to judge it harshly. And I don't know, I just generally think the structures that it lays out in those libidinal discursive configurations, or as I call them, LDCs, you just make Marx into like some stupid Althusser thing.
Yeah.
Or make Fisher into some like stupid Althusser thing. But anyway, I think those are, as developed as they can be in a fairly short essay. I don't think it's wrong or right. I think it's a way of, in many ways, rephrasing a lot of Nietzsche.
I think it's something that I've in some ways experienced. I think that's sort of why it has
his case study with Russell Brand's just kind of dog shit. And it's gotten beat up over the past
The
decade.
examples he gives are not great and have not aged well. However, the experience of being a leftist online and going to public events and supporting socialist candidates and watching the development of people break up movements, put them back together. There is a certain truth that he gets to.
I mean, I would also
he just does not articulate it with good examples.
Yeah, I would also say that there's a certain truth to this problem is the, last lifesaver of a not great essay. Like, if the best you can... Like, yes, I absolutely acknowledge there's a problem with vindictive judgmentality and being cruel for a Schadenfreudian sake that actually harms the movement than the left. I believe that. I believe that there is a role at which liberalized identity politics serves to blunt working class movements as well.
Well, and you saw this in the Hillary campaigns, in the Biden campaigns. He is identifying something that is very almost treated as a naturalization, which is whenever anybody brings up class, there is almost a reflexive media apparatus to tell you that you're racist or sexist.
Right. I think the issue is, one, you do have to be careful in how you talk about that, but I think more primarily the issue is when you're not grounding your articulation of this problem within materialism, you actually do open yourself up to the liberal critiques because you're arguing things on the liberals' grounds.
Right.
And I think there's a strain of left-wing thought about identity that gets called class reductionist, and I think the ironic thing is it actually treats class on the liberals' ground and tries to take the fight there, and I think that fails, and I think a lot of this essay kind of works on that. In my rereading, that's sort of the thought I have.
Well, it's also...
And once again, I will say that's a distinctive problem. I would say my overall thing with this essay is, I think the meat of the essay, if you're going to judge the essay on the thesis that it makes, you're talking about the DLCs, the LDCs.
The ideological state apparatus.
Right, yeah. You're talking about that insofar as that is a developed-ish structural theory line that Fisher's laid out. I think it's fine. I don't see it appearing in much of his other work. I haven't seen people with good takes about it generally. As it stands in the essay itself, fine. And then otherwise, he has the long diatribe about Russell Brand that just would be funny if it wasn't sad. And then he has his conclusion, which, yeah, I think I've made my thoughts about it. I think if you want to ask me, like, is this essay reactionary? No. Is this essay good? Not really, to me. But, yeah, that's where I live.
I think what you're also holding in this, and what I think we're both holding within this, is the legacy that this essay has been cited.
Well, if it laid out good theory, then it'd have a good legacy. That's fucking Lenin right there. that is classic Bolshevik epistemology, is if our theory is wrong, then why are we winning so hard? Or vice versa, if the socialist revolutionaries had such a great theory, why did we kill them all really easily?
The SRs.
But yeah, no, I mean, it's I mean, I think
have to go to the peasants.
I think something to the legacy of the essay is, okay, is it a good theory? Well, what's that mean? Well, how was it? What's the effect it had? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's
what do you think the effect is? Because I have my own.
I think that there's a lot of people who opportunistically use it to justify extremely reactionary and anti-left things that I don't think are necessarily supported by the essay or would be supported by Mark Fisher. But also I don't, on that second thing, who knows? But like, I think that happens on the one hand. I think on the other hand, I don't know. I don't see people putting together a positive synthesis. I mean, and maybe I just don't read enough fucking of whatever fucking theory this would be, but I don't see people saying, oh, well, let's think about the dynamic of the vampire castle and the neo-anarchists in understanding.
My take, similar to yours, but I think I'm grounding it more as a maybe a little materialistically and generationally. I think the people that I hear that academically take this article and use it kind of to their own ends to justify dubious philosophical projects and positions are mostly slightly older people who grew up as activists in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s and had all of these preconceived ideas of what the best way of organizing and all of these kind of like 90s ideas of what leftism is, what being a Trotskyist, what being an Orthodox Marxist is, what all of these things were that are grounded in like a Marxist theory that really didn't follow the kind of generation that came before it, and then entering into the internet space for the first time and being told by a bunch of nincompoops that came from middle class backgrounds, that all went to college and that were indoctrinated in a lot of academics that admittedly were oftentimes anti-Marxist, and if they were left-wing theory, they were like the two best philosophers, Chomsky and fucking Howard Zinn, and those were the extent of their class consciousness being raised. And so they go on the internet and they tell a bunch of academic activists who have all these ideas about what it means to be working class and Marxist, and telling them that they're wrong and that they're bad for thinking the way that they did because they occupy this. They don't understand these marginal communities that they're possibly not addressing, whereas within the academic sphere, they were taught that you had to first address them before addressing anything else.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, it's Jerry Seinfeld's daughter telling him his joke sucks.
Well, it's Catherine Liu calling them the Brahmin left, or it's the Ben Burges, or it's the this kind of sophistic argumentative left-wing people who are all on Zero Books, and they're all kind of taken aback by people who are telling them that they don't know what it means to have class solidarity, and here they are reading an essay about people being mean online to people who have experience in the academic and activist circles. And I think that's a lot of the legacy of this. I don't know how much that spills over into people who have reactionary positions like the Red Scares.
Yeah, your Red Scares, your Haas's, your whatever the fucks. Yeah, I mean, it's also like kind of a magnitude of difference in like income and reach. And, it's funny that I'm naming Ben Burgess on the larger end of that magnitude, but versus like Haas or whatever the fuck. Yeah, alright, well, that's our fucking episode on this shit. Cancel me, fuckers, I dare you.
Yeah, come at us.
I will. I was raised in the vampire castle. My blade was sharpened. I will fucking cancel your fucking daughter before you even make a move.
Before Jimmy Savile will bring her to you.
Yes. Anyway.
Brave young cowboys of the near north side, mount those bridge rails, ride all night, scream when captured, arch your back, let this whole town hear your knuckles crack. Sapphire Trans Am, high beams in bank.